Well, welcome. Yesterday, hopefully you didn't miss it, there was a bit of a bombshell for news. The devs, in a fairly quiet and almost offhanded way, revealed there will be a third expansion for Guild Wars 2, that they are working on it right now, and they even teased a little bit as to where it might be set. It's obviously really important news for the current climate with the game. I talked about that a lot yesterday, but today I want to go further into the idea of where it is, and that's based on some more hints that came out yesterday, but I had actually missed. So, we're going to be talking about Cantha, and the reason we're going to be talking about Cantha is, first of all, this image they gave us. This is the one piece of concept art we have to go on about the new X-Pack. And in yesterday's video, you'll see I did actually right-click it and try to save the image, and they hadn't named it with anything, you know, that cryptic. But turns out this image wasn't all that they'd released. They had also dropped this here, this little video, this little animation, which is kind of gorgeous, to be honest, and they've been doing this a lot recently. Most major releases for Guild Wars 2 give you some kind of animated art like this. You know, it reminds me of the old login screen style they had. I could just imagine logging in, looking at this big white image here. But so, if you right-click this one and go to download this one, well, you will see there is a much more explicit reference to Cantha right here. It says Xingji on there. Xingji being one of the regions of the Canthan continent from Guild Wars 1. I actually yesterday said that the big bell and stuff reminded me a bit of Xingji. If you head back into Guild Wars 1 here today, the server's obviously still live, you can go to Xingji Monastery and find a big bell like this. It really seems like this is going to be something Cantha related. On top of that, the blog post they revealed had like a subheader yesterday, and the subheader said, "The Winds of Change." Now, the Winds of Change was the name of a post-launch campaign content update for the Canthan region that came out in about 2009, I think, 2010. Essentially, Guild Wars 1 release had its heyday, and then in the long wait for Guild Wars 2, the devs basically started doing Living World for the original game. It started with some stuff in Central Tyria and the Crichton region, then it went up to deal with some Eye of the North stuff, and then it went to Cantha with this big, long line of quests that were really entertaining, probably the most challenging stuff that they did as well, called The Winds of Change. And I actually did a whole video series about that right when it came out. It was funny, as I was playing The Winds of Change was at the same time that the devs were announcing what the core professions were for Guild Wars 2. That's when these two things were coming out. So now, here in 2020, we see them reference the Winds of Change with some clearly Canthan looking art, and, you know, if you do a little bit of sleuthing, you can see they're even referencing one of the Canthan regions, that being Xingji. So it's definitely Cantha. I'm going to update yesterday's video right here and say, look, we're going to Cantha, guys. There's a third expansion, and it's based on that region. I wanted to give you guys really all the information as to how we know that is so now. And I wanted to talk a little bit... Oh, by the way, I think as well a developer necroed an old Canthan discussion thread on the forums, which makes this whole thing seem pretty blatant as well right there. They're actively encouraging people once again to talk about Cantha. I want to open the floor with a little something about Divinity's Reach and the general idea of going back there. Don't worry, I have lots of videos for you guys about the region of the world and what we can expect and why people are excited about that if you're kind of a newcomer to the scene, so don't worry. But today, I just want to open with, why Cantha, why now? And so, what do I mean by this? Well, if we rewind the clock to when Guild Wars 1 came out, we started in Ascalon, we did the adventure all the way over Core Tyria, ended at the Fire Island chain, did a couple of post-release quests, and we went back to the Southern Shiver Peaks for a little while at Sorrow's Furnace. That would actually be up here. And then they added a whole new campaign, like a year after release, way down south. So far down south, I'm not even talking about Alona, I'm talking even further down south, across the ocean, with a completely separated world map. And it was this region called Cantha with kind of a mixed Asian blend of architecture. What do I mean by that? I mean, it kind of crossed a lot of styles of Korean architecture with a lot of Chinese stuff, and maybe there's some other things mixed in there. I'm not really an expert on this subject. To create this thing that we in the West, ignorant as we may be, could just enjoy and feel like we were immersed in this different world with people with different sensibilities and ways of going about their life. And then you had a magical fantasy story laid on top of it that sometimes referenced this stuff. That's what they did way back in 2006. Fast forward into 2012, Guild Wars 2 comes out, and well, what do? Well, we have all the exploration for the core areas, minus some, like the Fire Island chain hadn't been added yet, and a couple of new areas had been added. The Maguma Jungle wasn't added, for example, the Crystal Desert wasn't added. And people were wondering, well, okay, so it's 2012, where does Guild Wars 2 go next? And funnily enough, I think most of us, probably up until the announcement of Heart of Thorns and the Maguma Jungle, which is ultimately where we went, I think most of us were expecting to go to Cantha. Way back then, in 2012, 2013. Why? Well, because that's what Guild Wars 1 did. We started in Tyria, then we went to Cantha, and then you'd expect to go to Nightfall and at the region of Alona and so on. And, well, ArenaNet declared and made it pretty obvious that that was not how Guild Wars 2 was going to go. They did Season 1, which was more just around the core areas of the world. Maybe they were scared of spreading the population out at that point. Then we went to a whole expansion in a very minor region, just the jungle. And really, this was not even that interesting of a place in terms of lore in Guild Wars 1, setting and building. But they got an entire expansion of it. Then more globetrotting, and we got to go back to the Fire Island chain. Then, was it going to be Cantha next for Expansion 2? Well, no, again. It was more appropriate for them, it seemed, to take us to Alona. But I'll hold you off at this point. One reason that they took us to these other regions may have been because this was just the story they wanted to tell. Mordramoth was going to be the next dragon because of the cool cryptic clues that they'd left, and so that led us to the Maguma Jungle. And then Balthazar had become a big part of the story, so naturally they wanted to come over here. You can say that. But there has actually been a little bit of a conspiracy over the years, let's say, a bit of a weird background piece of information that may have influenced them and caused them to not want to go to Cantha. And that is this mixing of the architectural styles. So let me just be clear, we've never really had an official, proper comment from the studio or anyone, in a big leadership position at the studio on this ever. But as we all know, ArenaNet is being published by NCSoft. I think specifically NC Software, so I'm not sure how the branches or whatever work. But the idea is, and NCSoft is based in Korea, the idea has been that what ArenaNet did with the Canthan region and the architectural stylings and all that stuff as an amalgam of the variety of other East Asian cultures was not something NCSoft was too happy with. Now, I know that sounds really weird, but the idea being that it wasn't a great idea to mix all these Chinese and then Korean styles together, and they didn't want to redo that. So maybe this had something to do with the fact that ArenaNet wanted to release in those regions. Obviously, we saw that right around Living World Season 1, they had that big push to market the game in Chinese territories and see what they could do there. I don't really think we hear anything about Kongzong, which was the branch, the small studio, I guess, that was dealing with Guild Wars 2 development over there in the East. We don't really hear about the Chinese version much anymore. I lost my access to the Chinese client a long time ago. But the guess is that maybe they didn't add the Canthan region so that this new market, which could potentially be a huge one, as we know other MMOs have done very well over there, could still be open to Guild Wars 2, and there would be no problem. It's one thing to get rid of depictions of skulls and blood and all that kind of stuff. It's another thing to completely swap and change all the assets and models. What I'm saying is all fairly speculative, but it's been kind of the prevailing opinion as to why Cantha wouldn't just come to Guild Wars 2, but would be impossible to come to Guild Wars 2. Because this was a hurdle they could not get over. How can you give people Cantha in Guild Wars 2 if it looks a way that would not be palatable to the studio's publisher and potential prospects in a major region elsewhere in the world? So, over the years, we have had one significant moment of discussion with this from the studio. It wasn't on an official platform, and it wasn't from a developer who was in a particularly prominent position to talk about these, obviously, big moves. But I do want to give it to you guys. Now, it's from Josh Foreman, who is a dev that was well-renowned for architecting and doing a lot of work on the Super Adventure Box, several of the big jumping puzzles like the Mad King's Clock Tower, and, he was an environment artist for a long time at the studio and a much-loved and outspoken member of the development team. He's no longer at the studio, let me be clear, and this quote I'm about to give you from him is years and years and years old, okay? But he did a podcast several years ago now. They called it, I think they're the Scotch Cast, and this episode is entitled A Lincoln Cast Interview with Josh Foreman. This was their 34th episode. It's several years old, and I'll play you a very small audio clip from these guys' Guild Wars 2 podcast right here. where they're talking to Josh about this area of Divinity's Reach, which currently, you can see, is called the Crown Pavilion. But at launch, this area of Divinity's Reach was a giant hole in the ground. And they were asking Josh about this giant hole in the ground. The background story here is that the initial lore for Divinity's Reach, as it was given to us before Guild Wars 2 came out, was that you had various districts that different civilizations of humanity had come to live in as refugees. Humanity was on the back step. So, for example, Rurikton, this is all Ascalonians, and it's a district filled with Ascalonian architecture and a gate to Ebonhawk, and people who want to talk about, you know, the fallen angels and the Char conflict and, you know, celebrates great Ascalonian heroes. This is an Ascalon district. You've got over here the Ossen Quarter. This was Elonan. And, you know, you can see that they're talking, I mean, it's called the Ossen Quarter. It's in reference to Churai Ossa. And you can hear people talking about their homeland, which at launch had been disconnected. There was going to be another one, a Canthan Quarter. I don't know whether it was actually going to be called the Canthan Quarter, but Canthans are another, you know, form of humans in the lore. And they, in theory, could have had refugees that were fleeing from Elder Dragon crises and whatever else and had come to settle in Divinity's Reach. And the lore was that they'd have their own district. What was that district? It was right here. And in early trailers for Guild Wars 2, you could see their architecture had been modeled and built for Guild Wars 2, and it was all filtered in. So, for example, my character's a new character and hasn't actually been up to the Ossen Quarter. But if we go up to the Ossen Quarter, you will see it is lovingly decorated and made with all these elaborate forms of architecture and assets that just weren't anywhere else in Guild Wars 2 for years. They were here because they were in reference to, you know, the Elonans, and maybe one day we'd go to Elona. And of course now in 2020 that's true. But all these lovely assets, these had all been built. There were equivalents, but with kind of these mixed East Asian styles, blending namely Korean and Chinese ideas, over here at this district. Yet by the time release came, it was all gone. It had become a giant hole in the ground. And there were some cryptic clues and hints as to why that hole might be there. Did it have something to do with the Elder Dragon Primordus, you know, that created this big sinkhole? Was there a conspiracy going on with the Queen? Well, we didn't know. And it remained a hole in the ground that the devs didn't talk much about until Season 1, when they rebuilt it in the Crown Pavilion and kind of moved away from all the lore they were hinting at there, and especially moved away from the idea of having a Canthan Quarter. So it's on the subject of this hole that these guys on the Lincoln Cast podcast get Josh Foreman to talk a little bit about.
Pretty much everyone in that guild has run around that entire, like, hole in the ground and is trying to, like, jump off. Just trying to jump up over those, like, invisible walls and shit, just trying to get down there because we just want to see what's there.
There's such an amazing story behind that hole that, you know, I might get in trouble for telling you this, but this isn't future stuff. This is why that hole exists from a development standpoint.
Okay.
It's, okay, so don't tell anyone.
Sure. I promise.
And I will link you guys in the comments of this video, that full podcast, if you'd like to. I don't want to just steal their content. I want to push you to other talents. I don't even know if they're around or doing Guild Wars stuff at this point, to be honest. This is all very old history. It's really weird that we're talking about this now in 2020. But I will read you basically a full quote, as was reformatted by a Reddit user several years ago as well. Basically, Josh said this: "That hole has such an amazing story. I might get into trouble for telling this stuff, but we had a Cantha district there, and it was built out, it was polished, it was beautiful. We kept getting feedback about the Asian market, and everyone was having a problem with it because the Chinese don't like their architecture mixed with Korean architecture, and vice versa. Fantasy is always a mix of different cultures. That's just how fantasy works, but not over there apparently. And it got to the point where we were like, well, what do we do with this spot? We don't have time to rebuild this, so we just nuked it. But new lore is going to get out of this, so that's pretty cool." So that's kind of what he said. I want to be clear that that little comment in that podcast was not the only thing over the years. There have been some very, very vague minor hints in other places as well. But that's probably the most well-known, most reputable one. That's the one that I want to focus on. And so with that in mind, people have always assumed that since a Cantha district can't exist and had to be blown up, how the hell can Cantha itself exist? People have assumed that NCSoft had a problem with the idea of Cantha, it wasn't going to happen, and that was the end of it. And it's been quiet on that front for years and years and years and years. Now, today, here they are, pretty much confirming to us we're going back to Cantha. So what changed? Well, I guess that one thing might have happened here, that there's no change at all, and instead they're just being very careful about exactly how they want to present this architecture, these stylings, to us in the Guild Wars 2 expansion. Namely, what I'm saying is it might not be 100% faithful recreation of how the Guild Wars 1 stuff looked. Would I be upset with that? Not really, to be honest, because Guild Wars 1 is looking more and more dated by the year right now. And while the most recent expansion, Path of Fire, did some incredible stuff, like the Desolation in particular feels so much like Guild Wars 1, but just a more beautiful, up-to-date version. While they did some good stuff, they also did some very divergent stuff. You know, if you look at Vabi in Guild Wars 2 with its massive buildings, it doesn't really look comparable to the original game. I mean, vaguely so. But the devs have clearly had their own take with it, and it looks great, and it's been fun to explore, and it's felt like Elona. And you know what? It's been 250 years. So maybe that's what they've just gone with this. Maybe another thing is they don't care about the Chinese market anymore. Maybe they've deemed that the game over there is not big enough or is not doing enough. I mean, there has to be a reason we don't really hear about it very much, right? So maybe they've decided that that's not important. Maybe NCSoft themselves have changed their mind. Maybe we were wrong in the community on this the whole time. And the truth is that the devs had always just given us stories and expansions in places that they felt it was appropriate. I've always been the first person online to say, blatantly, it is not the duty of Guild Wars 2 to copy everything Guild Wars 1 did. So what? Guild Wars 1 took us to Cantha first. Did Guild Wars 2 have to? No, it's its own game. Guild Wars 2 could have easily got by, never taking us there whatsoever. It's a huge, rich, amazing world filled with locations that we can go to. Why would we have to go back down to this one just because it was in the first game? Not every feature from the first game, not every set piece from the first game has to exist in the second for the second one to justify itself. So I would have been happy if we didn't go to Cantha at all. It turns out we are, and maybe we are just because the story is going to be gearing itself that it's actually relevant and appropriate. And, well, that takes me on to the story, which I want to talk about in some upcoming videos. I want to give you guys some crash courses on what's going on down there, just so that you've got an idea of why it's exciting for current Guild Wars 2 stories too, and we could even talk a little bit about the feature base and the kind of things that were there, give you some gameplay from it. It should be pretty fun. I love that the devs have announced this, because it gives me a ton of things to talk to you guys about for the next year or so, maybe longer, as they actually get the expansion rolling. So let me know if you guys would be interested in that. I presume you are. And hopefully you've enjoyed this little background story about what Cantha has been in the mind of this community, and maybe some of the troubles that the studio has had for all these years. We're now entering a new phase of Guild Wars 2 where everything I've mentioned here today is gonna drop out of your mind and you're gonna forget it was ever a thing. So here, I'll chronicle it one final time. That's the situation with Cantha as it's always been, and as of yesterday, it seems things have changed. Let me know what you think about any of that, guys. See you in the next one. Take care.